What we're going to do here is save everyone from getting massive amounts of civil penalties, making sure your aircraft or whatever you have gets certificated in a proper and a fast manner. And if you need any type of guidance or insurance, talk to Dave Crick right there. So we have a great group of folks here that are going to talk to us about just if you build it, you fly. And we also added on the regulatory or business models. We're going to take a look at business models as well. Introduce myself, and then I'll have the panelists introduce themselves. Again, as Al said, I'm David Hernandez. I work at the law firm of Vedder Price. We're the largest law firm in the world when it comes to aircraft transaction and regulatory work. And our specialty is we fix things, we clear regulatory hurdles, and we make life easier for folks in the audience. So, Gerhard?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Gerhard Deiters. I'm a lawyer from Germany. I feel like a little bit like an alien here, not only because I'm a lawyer, but actually I'm not in the aviation business as deep as you are. Our law firm is based in Cologne, so I can see EASA building from my office. And what we do is we provide legal advice or legal project management throughout entire lifespan of a project, from the beginning when the first SUW is drafted until the end of contract. And so we are in a lot of big programs, and actually we come from the space sector because two of my colleagues have been in the legal department of the German Aerospace Center, and so we are involved in Galileo, etc. And a couple of years ago, we have always also been involved, or since a couple of years, we are also involved in drones. And yeah, that's why I'm here.
Dave?
Hi, everybody. I'm so glad you're all here. I was kind of afraid there'd be nobody out there at this point, so I'm really glad y'all are attending. I'm going to give you a little bit of my more background than I usually, just a little bit to kind of give perspective of where I'm coming from. So my first career, I actually flew for the Air Force for 9 years. I primarily was a KC-10 guy, so I spent a lot of time, even though it was in a military environment, it was basically heavy aircraft, on-demand passenger and cargo charters, essentially what I did, moving stuff around. After that, for the last 10 or 15 years, I've owned a Cessna Cardinal, much to my wife's chagrin. It's probably the best outfitted Cessna Cardinal in North Texas. I'm a lawyer in Dallas, Texas, double Aspen, Garmin 750. Spent a lot of time going around the Class B airspace at Dallas Love Field, avoiding Southwest airplanes. So I say that all to say that I have maybe a perspective as an aircraft operator. My main job is for the last 25 years, I got out of the Air Force about the same time David did. We went to the Air Force Academy roughly about the same time.
Yep.
Got out and focused on, for the last 20 plus years, I focused on primarily business aviation. Some 121, 125. Most of my clients are 91 or 135 operators. Most of my practice and what I'm most fascinated about is the policy of aircraft operations and regulatory oversight. So that's kind of why I'm on this panel, and trying to meld together meeting the demands or interests of the regulator with spent a lot of time counseling my clients on how to interface with that and deal with that. A lot of very active, both David and I are very active in NATA and MBAA, a lot of committee work on, and a lot of that is just interacting with the regulators. So that's where I'm coming from.
Okay, great. Neil?
Hi everyone, my name is Neil Cloughley. I spent some 15 years in the commercial aircraft market, so dealing with the big toys, as I like to call them, and that's a range from the regionals all the way through to the big stuff that you fly intercontinental on. Our family background is involved in the UAV market, has been involved in the UAV market, so we have some 30 years worth of experience of dealing with drones and autonomous flight and beyond the horizon line of sight flight. This is back in the day of sort of mid-80s, early 90s. Our family created the world's first combat drone about 4 years before the Predator came to existence. And so when you've dealt in that environment, when you understand some of the issues that were raised even back then versus some of the notions and ideas that are being put forward today, history teaches us a lot of things. And you can look back on history to give us a real good guide and steer as to what is possible and what isn't. So coming forward, coming out the commercial aircraft market, where again, having been involved in the whole leasing environment, The sale, acquisition, the management of assets, which models work, which don't, how you can have a ERJ 135 with 20 packs on board taking up a valuable slot at a major airport where you could be putting an A380 with 400 people on board. These are the sort of issues and questions now that are becoming ever more prevalent. And so from that we came out, we said, well, hang on a minute, it's just bizarre that in 2014, as it was then, we cannot go 2 hours from Cheltenham to London without having to go by road, rail, or coach. And to give you an idea of just how bad it is in the UK, to go from Cheltenham to London tomorrow at peak time will cost you £247 return on the train. There are people doing this every day. £10,000 a year for the privilege to go to work. Now, we don't have aircraft flying that, and there's a very good reason why we don't have aircraft flying that, and we'll cover some of that. And so we decided to set up a company, Faradair. So we were formed within weeks of Zunum in 2014. So we've been around 4 years now, and we've been working at our approach to how we're going to do that. And unlike XTI and Zunum, I'm going to tell you all about that in 5 minutes in the pitching session, so we'll do that later.
Great, thank you, Neil. So what we're going to talk about is kind of broad here. If you see some of the overview topics, we're going to talk about certification generally, business aircraft or business aviation ventures, eVTOL, drone package services, and just basically regulations and whether or not they're stifling. And are the regulators keeping up with the aviation? And what's next? What's the next innovative disruptor? So, Neil, getting aircraft certification so difficult. You're right in the midst of that type of stuff. What are your thoughts?
It's obviously it's the key part. Putting the asset in the sky is the easiest thing you're going to do. Notion that if you want to go and see it, go and look on YouTube. You'll find some Czechoslovakian guy with a bathtub with 4 quadcopters attached to it. I mean, putting something in the sky is not the problem. The problem comes with when you are making decisions as to whether that's just going to be your activity. So if you want to go and make yourself a greasy spot on the side of a mountain, well, then you knock yourself out and go and do it. But when you get regulators involved and they're saying you want to carry passengers, that's when it's a whole different ballgame. You are now asking somebody to put their name and their signature to your capability. So promises are great, and there's an awful lot of hype, and I have to admit, after some of the presentations, I wanted to run out of here and go and buy myself an eVTOL tomorrow. Sounds awesome. Sounds great. The problem is there is a much wider issue for these guys to have to take into consideration. Noise is the huge one. There are certain areas and environments whereby you just will not be able to operate. And so therefore, the regulator has been tasked, unlike Tesla, who came into the industry and just said, yep, we're going to create a car and we're going to put it on the road and this is what we're going to do. There's no regulator in charge of the roads. There is with the skies. So it doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter what you think your business model is worth or where you think things should be going. You have to go and bow down to the gods of the regulation services. Now, that is not a single entity body. So when you're dealing with them, you are going to find a siloed organization that doesn't talk to each other, that takes 50 million years to make a decision about whether you want to have cups of tea or coffee around the table, and then you want to talk to them about what you're doing. Use the guide of the likes of Mitsubishi, Regional Jet, Honda. You've heard some of the examples. These are traditional aerospace companies using traditional aircraft assets taking 10 plus years. And if you have anybody who tells you they are going to give you a certified passenger carrying eVTOL in the next 4 years, it's nonsense, okay? There is a long process involved in this, and the reason is because these guys have got the responsibility to make sure that these things are not going to be dropping in on our roofs anytime soon. Unfortunately, as part of that, that means that we have got to go through many hoops, many channels, many corridors. The intention is good. They are all very keen, but it's a real long process. So the more simple you can keep that, the better.
So Dave and Gerhard, from both your perspectives from the US and the EU, what are your thoughts on regulation? Are there too many restrictions? Are they keeping up with the regulators? Are they keeping up with innovation?
Yeah, so very similar comments to what you said. So I told people before this we were probably going to be the wet blanket because we're going to kind of slow stuff down a little bit. I love the technology. I love the presentations. I'm responding a little bit to some of the comments that I've heard over the last 2 days. Absolutely fascinating. Is it too stifling? In a sense, you're asking the wrong question. And to pick up more on the FAA side of with some of what you talked about, the FAA is not a single organization. You can talk to 50 different safety inspectors, 50 different people, you're going to get 50 different answers. The people that deal with the technology, the oversight of the hardware, ironically, that's actually, especially with the Part 23 rewrite, that's the easier group to deal with. I think a lot of people are not focused on the operational side of the house, is what you were talking about. And in the U.S., the big distinction between commercial and non-commercial, and I've heard a lot of conflation of terms over the last 2 days that don't understand that parsing. You have to understand with these regulators in the U.S., they're governed by the Federal Aviation Act of 1958. They don't have a lot of discretion to do some of the things that you all want to do. They have to live within the statute, and the statute says that their primary emphasis is safety. It's not economic development of the aviation industry, especially after the value jet crash. It's safety. Now, does that mean they're not going to work with you? No, but it's going to be along their timeframes, and they're going to look at it through the lens of, from the hardware side, is it a safe aircraft? From the operational side, is it a safe operation? So let me say one more thing, and then I'll give up this. One thing I kept hearing, and I'm a pilot, I've flown all kinds of different stuff. It is so true that statistically it is safer to fly than drive when I go to the airport tomorrow. But that, and I tell my clients all the time, but then I say that's a little bit of a misleading characterization. Why is that the case? Because it's a lot harder to be a captain on a 777 for one of the major air carriers than it is to drive a taxi cab. It's the regulatory oversight that has made that statistic possible. And guess what? As you come down the slope, and I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but when you come down to the smaller aircraft, the safety does not stay the same. So, you know, we've been our own worst enemy in the sense that we've created this incredibly safe industry, but that's not because that just happened. It largely, to a large extent, is due to the regulatory oversight.
Well, for Europe, I can say that, of course, I can only stress what my colleagues said. I mean, EASA already has the word safety in its name, so of course they are stressing safety over economical value. When it comes to eVTOL, with piloted eVTOL, I mean, they are already in the process of certifying, and operations are maybe not at the doorstep, but we will see them on the more or less short term. I mean, not shortest term, but short term. But what I was mainly interested in a couple of years ago, when people planted the image of flying taxi drones, autonomous flying taxi drones over our city in my head, I asked myself, I mean, what are the regulatory restrictions? And actually, I could play the devil's advocate and say, well, there are no regulatory restrictions, but that's not the truth, because the new basic regulation, which has been issued by the European Union some 3 months ago, it does not even contain regulation about unpiloted systems. When the regulation talks about unmanned systems, it talks about unmanned piloted systems and not about unmanned unpiloted systems. So if we're talking about regulatory restrictions or the horizon when we will see drone taxis flying over a city, we have just to see that there is not even a regulatory framework which would allow such operation. So it's not about certifying or operations or something like this at the moment. There is just not the legal framework for it.
Yeah. So quick rapid fire questions on the last 3 questions. Just yes or no. Are regulators keeping up with innovation? Will we ever see a supersonic business jet? And when anyone ever make money at $200 million a pop? Neil, yes, no, yes, no. What are your thoughts?
No, yes, no.
As much as they can, yes. I don't know.
Yeah?
No, yes, don't know.
Got it. All right. Business aviation for the masses. So that's an interesting one. It kind of touches upon some of the business models we've seen. So basically, from my perspective, and I think, Dave, we both are on the NBA tax committee and RIAG, and we do a lot of this stuff. And so what we see is basically there's 2 types of realities here. You're either, when you get in trouble, I should say, you either are ignorant with respect to the regulations or you're arrogant. And those 2 together don't make a great mix. So there is various ways in which to become informed about the regulatory requirements, whether you're dealing with business aviation, commercial aviation. I think here today we have 2 great groups, NBAA and NATA, that can assist with the education. There's great resources for both of those. You have the EBA in the EU. But what we've seen here is at least, is this ever going to be something for the masses? And for each one of you, the question is, what are your thoughts? Will commercialization ever become a reality? Neil.
I think it has to. The sector will have to change in order for us to make a viable alternative to some of the lunacy which is being put out there right now. You look at the UK as a classic example. HS2. This was a project of a high-speed rail link to save 20 minutes to go from London to Birmingham. That was a £30 billion project. That very quickly became a £55 billion project, and it's just been announced that it's probably going to overrun by another 50 billion. So for that 20 minutes saving, we are now at 100 billion for an antiquated rail technology. That doesn't strike me as sensible in the current age. But to bear that into context, you think of the number of people that you can put onto a train at every given moment of an hour, and you think then of how you've got to incorporate aircraft into a same sort of competitive environment where you're taking enough bums on seats between point A and point B, the infrastructure that requires in and around a city, and what the impact on that city is, it is a big, big ask here. There are a number of variables that can be addressed and will be addressed, but we have to get there. But how we do that is in a smooth, steady, staggered process. We're going to get there by getting new types of models where people, instead of taking the first-class train to commute to work, are going to actually be in what is effectively a private aircraft. But they're going to do that every day, and they're going to get to know their neighbors, and they park in the same car park, and they're going to fly in the morning, and then they come back in the evening with the same people. And what you're going to end up seeing then is this regular sort of semi-scheduled commercial service, as opposed to sort of ad hoc charter, with aircraft that have got the old adage from the commercial market of bums on seats, the CASM model. It's a case of the more bums you can put on seats going to a given location, given the fact that pilot costs are going to probably go up, because there is a pilot shortage, and so whenever there's a shortage, demand means that prices rise. That means that the more people you can get involved in and around that vehicle, then you're actually making that work. If you've only got 3 or 4 people in that vehicle and your pilot's costing you 90 grand a year and going up, it becomes a real problem. So yes, there is definitely a model there that can come into fruition. What's it going to look like? How big is it going to be in terms of the vehicle is the variable, because of regulation. So like the 9-seat limit, are we going to see that nudge to 15? Who knows? A lot of it's going to be driven by the industry. A lot of people are going to be putting pressure on for that to happen. And it will have to happen, but again, it's a question of how quickly can that come and who are going to be the lobbying agents who've got enough capital, time, resources, and cash in order to push the regulators into that position.
Got it. So Dave, your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are slightly different, although I think it's a choice of terms. So in the U.S., keep in mind that the philosophical underpinning of non-commercial operation of business aviation is if you're flying yourself around, you're on the hook, you have civil liability, you have regulatory liability, you're paying for it out of your own pocket, you're paying attention to the pilots and so forth, and you're not carrying people who are paying for it, 91's enough. There's enough angst hanging over your head that you can be safe. The philosophical difference is that as you start moving down the other way, you're trying to shield liability, you're carrying people that have no clue how the pilots are trained and that type of thing, and they're paying for it. At some point, you've crossed over the line, and now the FAA says, yeah, you can do that, but we're going to impose an additional layer of regulatory oversight. For most of what we're talking about, that's a 135 air carrier certificate, to make sure that we're protecting the people in the back. So if you have that construct, I want my clients that are businesses that are using the airplane for themselves to be able to do that under Part 91, under the lower regulatory burden. As a consumer, I want the people that are out trying to make money to comply with 135. So I want that. I personally think that's a valid split. So if you look at it from that way, no, you should not simply just commercialize business aviation. You shouldn't necessarily do cost sharing, because those are 2 different animals. And you actually can hurt the other one if you try and lump it all into the other side. That's my personal opinion.
Got it. And so, Gerhard, with respect to that, I want to throw in, so we saw Private Flight have a discussion today about their business model, and you've got Victor in the UK, and you've also got JetSmarter doing stuff in Europe. What are your thoughts about that? Business aviation for the masses, is that the avenue to do that?
Actually, I'm really not an expert on that, so I would say I would only take time off the clock if I try to answer that.
Got it. All right, so just generally, what do you see in Europe then with respect to just business aviation for the masses? Is there anything going on now that you think is relevant?
Yes, I think so. I think there is demand. I think there will be offers. So all what I've heard from the last conferences and my talks with many businesses and also with the people from EASA themselves, I would say yes. But actually, I don't have an idea what will be what will be the time frame, what will be really the mass. So. Actually, I think yes, but I cannot tell to what extent.
Got it. So the questions there about the regulations and are regulators keeping up with innovation? Just last week, the Department of Transportation issued some new regulations, air charter regulations, specifically to address that. They wanted to try to make it easier for air charter brokers. And so folks like JetSmarter and Private Fly and Stellar and Victor, for example, are all now considered air charter brokers, based on the DOT regulations. And they will be regulated as of February 14th, 2019, so Valentine's Day. It's kind of a joke, right? So you're going to get...
Love from DOT.
Yeah, the DOT. And so you're going to get a little love note in the form of consent order if you're doing something wrong. And I've heard it on very reliable advice that every one of these folks, these new air charter brokers, are being looked at right now, and they're analyzing their business models. And interestingly, I just looked at their websites on my phone before I came up, and 3/4 of them are not in compliance. One has a very good website, but there are folks that are not in compliance. So I'd highly recommend, to the extent that you're in any of these innovative models, look at your web presence, because right now you could be whacked with about $32,000 a day civil penalty. But David, do you have any thoughts on that? Or?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great summary. It's two points to add to that. This is a rule that's been in the making. We came out of the 125, 135 advisory rulemaking committee that kind of planted the seed on this. That was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Yeah. We've been talking to DOT between the agencies about this rule forever. Now, keep in mind, DOT is the economic oversight. It's not the FAA safety oversight, but they still have a very important role to play. And ironically, sometimes they have the sharper teeth because they haven't perhaps when they enforce, they typically have a better case. Let me put it that way. So that's an example of you got to pay attention to what you're doing for those agencies. I do think it's going to be interesting how the rule is out to see, especially with this ability to aggregate groups, how that's going to roll out.
And that's a good point. So it took over 10 years just to create the regulations. We're just talking to create the regulations so people can be regulated. So when someone puts up that they're going to get a 135 in eVTOL by 2023, they're not even going to have the regulations until about 2028. Think about that. I don't see how that's going to happen, but I'm always interested in learning. So, eVTOL and package delivery. Gerhard, what are your thoughts about that, and what's EE doing in that realm?
Yeah, that's a nice question. I mean, I think 3 years ago, there was a big publication in Germany about the German Postal Service delivering the first packages with a drone in a very narrow corridor in the northern part of Germany. And since that, I think there has not been much of a change. I mean, we are talking about, or they're talking about the parcel, the guy who was driving the car has a couple of drones in the back of the car, and you push the button, and the drones will deliver all the packages to the homes next to the car. And actually, this is a nice idea. Whether this will happen at a certain time, I don't know, but at the moment also we do not have the regulatory framework for that, because if we say that we need a pilot, we only are allowed to use piloted unmanned aerial vehicles. It means one vehicle, one pilot, and pushing one button and sending 6 or 8 drones to the houses is not covered by the regulatory framework at the moment. in the end, we will see drone delivery. Maybe not in the mass market and not so early in the mass market, but of course we will see drones delivering blood at the site of an accident. We will see drones delivering highly critical stuff to hospitals, etc. But for the mass market, meaning a parcel delivery by the postal services of goods ordered via Amazon, I think that's nothing which we see in the nearest future. We will see it eventually, but this is a long road to go because we do not have the regulatory framework at the moment, at least not in Europe.
Yeah, so let me ask you this, just follow up, and I'll stick with you, Gerhard. What countries are getting it right? Who's doing it right, and who are the entities to watch, if you care to say?
I don't know which countries are doing it right.
You can include our panelists too.
Well, which countries are doing it right? I mean, the countries which do not have to care about the public opinion so much, who can change the regulatory framework very fast. They will do it right if you say so. But at the moment, I don't see that anyone is doing it right. I mean, at the moment we have seen some tenders from some countries or some authorities who asked to, let's say, analyze the existing regulatory framework and make a draft of a model regulatory framework. And actually, we have participated in one of the tenders and as a subcontractor and even won it. So in the next month, we will be dealing with drafting model frameworks for such scenarios. And I'm really, let's say, excited whether this will land in a drawer or if it really comes to reality. So yeah, I'm very looking forward to this work, and I hope this work will have some use in the future.
Neil, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can just give you an update from a UK perspective what's going on here. We've been part of the Urban Air Mobility Working Group, which is just in its 4th meeting now. It was founded just in the last 12 months because it simply wasn't being looked at. We have a group called Nesta in the UK who have launched a thing called the High Flying Challenge. That basically opened up 5 cities in the UK for the opportunity to look at the commercialization of drone services. One of which was the blood deliveries between 2 hospitals in London, where ordinarily it could take 45 minutes to get blood from one hospital to another, yet a drone could just skip straight across the river and do it in a 2-3 minute window. Now, that's really good because it is very, very helpful to the people who are in the hospitals, and therefore it means public give it the big thumbs up. That is a really important factor in this. We currently have a mayor in London who is just about to introduce a policy, which many of you will not know about, that basically will ban any future helicopter or rotorcraft expansion in the City of London. So all the eVTOL idea of flying drones or anything like this in London will be buried if that goes through. As you can imagine, there is quite the scramble at the moment to re-educate the mayor that he may not be making the wisest decision of his political career because it's just been put in there without anybody really realizing that it was being put in through the back door. So there's a lot going on at the moment where you've got to overcome political and public perceptions about things, but you can do that by bringing in certain services. But I'll add one caveat to that. In 1988, I was at a military UAV test, and when you see that drone and the operator suddenly disappear, and that drone is flying up a major motorway out of your control, and it crash lands 25 miles away, that is a heart-stopping moment. And it is a really horrific moment. And so that is something with regard to this market where command and control and a pre-agreed process. There will be corridors, there will be opportunities for these things to operate, but there must be a pre-agreed option that when that thing pops out of its channel, when it does something untoward, there is not a debate, there's not a discussion. There is going to be an instant action happens, and everybody knows what that's going to be. Again, this has got to be discussed, it's got to be put through. And once we get that laid out, then people can go, oh, okay, so if this thing suddenly goes that way, its parachute's going to deploy and it's going to drop where it is or whatever's going to happen. But if people think there's a chance one of these is going to suddenly go AWOL and come flying in through the bedroom window, yeah, you can imagine there's going to be mass opposition to this. So, yeah, it's coming, and there's a lot of good activities coming, but there's a lot to do.
Got it. So, Dave, your thoughts on that? What's from the U.S. perspective?
So I'll answer it by answering the question that we keep asking is regulation, too many restrictions, is it keeping up with innovation? Keep in mind, in the United States, we want to have our cake and eat it too. So on the one hand, we say, hey, we need to cut back on the administrative agencies. We don't want to fund them. We don't want to spend money on that. The other side is when there's a Buffalo crash, when there's ValueJet, when there's a Teterboro crash, then we go to our congressman and we tell the FAA, you must regulate to this. The FAA it only has so much bandwidth. So it's this catch-22 of them trying to make rules that want to make us safer, but at the same time, we want them out of the way. And there's a thing called the Administrative Procedures Act. That's the guidelines that they have to follow to make sure that they don't over-regulate and improperly regulate. Right. And that's a process that they have to go through. But guess what? That's not a 60-day process. That's a 60-month process. And it's a trade-off of having the right kind of regulation. So that's why I said earlier, they're keeping up as much as they can, but they're never going to be as fast as you all are as far as creating new software and that kind of thing.
Never. Realistic regulatory considerations. What can we or should we expect? And I think that goes to what you were saying from the regulators. What can they do? I mean, they're a safety agency. Their job is safety. And I think at the end of the day, we have to have a reasonable understanding of what they do. I mean, so disruptor, if you're an FAA guy and you hear disruptor, you're thinking somebody at the airport who doesn't have their ID ready, right? That's a disruptor. That's supposed to be a joke, but that's, you get it, right? Right.
Here every night. Yeah.
There we go. So all three of you guys, what should we expect from the regulators? What's realistic? Do we need uniform standards? What about traffic management? Massive hurdles to clear.
There are. I mean, if you look at the traffic management issue, for example, and you just look at the conflicting positions we've had in the last 2 days about volume and numbers. If it's a land-based, radar-based system that we have today, expecting the volumes that people are talking about is just non-realistic, okay, from a traffic management perspective. That means, do we go fully automated? Do we go into a satellite-based system? In which case, does your cost model suddenly then jump because you're using satellite comms? All these types of things are going to have an impact where traffic management is an issue that will be solved. We will come up with the solutions, and the regulators that are dealing with this right now, you ask them, and they look at you blankly, and they go, what vehicle? And it's going, where? A lot of these guys just don't even have a finger pulse on what's going on. Fortunately, on the Urban Air Mobility Group, we've got a regular representation from the CAA. They're coming in, they're getting a handle on what this is all about, the types of vehicles they can expect to see. So I think they're doing the best they can, but as was mentioned, they have a limited bandwidth of capacity. And I think certain people may expect, if they say, we want this done, they will expect it done tomorrow. When they come back and say, actually, we'll get back to you, it's going to be probably 6, 7, 8 months. The current Silicon Valley thinking of things, which is, no, we do it tomorrow. And I lived here for 4 years. It's the great element about here that is fantastic. It's can do, let's do. In the UK, we're the complete opposite of that. It's like, no, boy, there's 20 reasons why you can't do that. Yeah. And so I think that, yes, they are trying. Uniform standards are a definite thing that is going to have to be discussed. The one thing that scares the honest hell out of me right now is there are certain groups flying around in the world with their own personal little VTOL thing, and they're doing all sorts of little tests. Going back to the 77 incident with the Pan Am building is a classic example. Yeah, I mean...
Don't spoil it.
Okay, we'll come back to that. There are some issues that we do need to think about as a unified group, and therefore coming up with some form of uniform standards. Is that going to be led by Uber, or is it going to be led by everybody here in the room?
Yeah.
And in which case, how do we coordinate that?
Dave, your thoughts?
I'll just second what Neil said is, I don't want to over-defend the regulatory agencies, but if you're dealing with them and you're putting this in context, you have to understand what their mandate is and approach it from that angle. Going in and taking a different approach is not going to work.
All right. Gerhard.
Yes, I mean, I only can talk about EASA, and when I was at a more or less similar conference in Cologne this year, I had the impression that half of EASA staff was there, and they listened to the audience. They were very communicative. They offered discussions, and I think that they have taken the right approach. At least from my perspective. I mean, first they will allow test beds, then they will expand this, and in the end they will have a look on that the operations will comply with all the safety standards. And as David said, we have to take this into the consideration that this will take time, and we should not be too much pressing, because what they are doing, they're focusing on safety, and I think at least EASA is doing it the right way.
All right. So, question there, and this is simple yes or no. You can expand upon it if you want, I guess. Do investors really appreciate the regulatory risk? And I say, not safety risk, regulatory risk. Is your product or new technology going to be certificated in the timeline that you need? Neil. Well, he's doing it right now, so.
I'm just working through what answer I give now is either going to affect our business significantly with investors we're trying to attract,
right,
or whether it's a realistic answer. I'm going to give you the realistic answer. Basically, I don't think investors do have a true grasp. Certainly, if they have a traditional ROI exit window of 7 years type thing, there are, for certain projects, some real long windows on this. There are easier ways to shortcut that. You'll hear about that in our pitch. Yeah. But yeah, I think there are some savvy investors who understand it, and they're in for the long play, which is great. But those who think they're going to come in, make a quick buck off an eVTOL and get out, yeah, no.
It was a little more than a yes/no, but I'll give it to you because you're a manufacturer. Dave.
I will say, from what I heard on the stage, I'm not sure that they do. From what I heard talking to people outside, I think perhaps they do.
Got it. Neil. I mean,
Gerhard.
Gerhard.
Again, it's not a yes or no. I think it's the one and the other. I mean, some do, some don't. So I totally agree with Neil.
Yeah. So in the States, we have this thing called the Administrative Procedure Act, and so everybody that goes through the FAA process, or the DOT process, is going to have to deal with this if they get to a point where the FAA or the DOT says, no, you can't do it. And so I put in two cases here. Those are cases that I argued and we won at both stages. The FAA with safe extensions. It's actually a new technology, and I think you guys get technology, right? Some people say the case is too technical. And CS Aviation Services, another case we won at the U.S. District Court, U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals and D.C. Circuit. You know, read both of those cases, because that's what's going to happen if you hit a roadblock and the FAA says no under any circumstances. Very interesting cases, very dense legal cases, but that's what you're going to deal with when you hit that roadblock and the FAA says no, you can't do it. The FAA and all agencies have to be governed by the Administrative Procedure Act, meaning that their explanations have to be reasonable and based on fact. And those cases were, I think in the safe extension cases, actually that was Judge Kavanaugh was on the three-judge panel, so just throw that out there, a little bit of history. But on that case, that was the first case that the a court in the D.C. Circuit had ever called the FAA's actions ludicrous, and not in the hip-hop way. So read the case, it's kind of interesting, right? So Neil mentioned this. So the folks that have been around for a while, this is the 1977 tragedy of New York Airways, New York Airway. That helicopter flipped off the then Pan Am building, now the Met Center building. It was a very tragic accident. The blades broke off, sliced 4 people in half, and killed another person on the ground. And for folks that do remember the footage, I was 11, so I don't remember a damn thing. But the people that do remember it, it was very tragic. This is worst case scenario for all of us in the room that deal with this. This is it. This is absolutely what we don't want to see. Never happened again. They transitioned. They had new safety regulations with regarding to flights in and out of New York, particularly with this type of stuff. But history does repeat itself if we don't remember from prior mistakes. And so, you know, your thoughts on that, and just a general question about why we need to be careful.
Well, I sort of alluded very quickly. There seem to be certain companies that are just disappearing off and doing their own thing right now. That's great. First to the market, all that good charge. The only issue is that affected helicopter operations over a city and other cities for decades. The same thing could apply in this industry. Whilst you may have the ego and the arrogance to think that you're just going to go out there and just do it, if you get it wrong, you are affecting all of us in this industry.
Right.
And that is something that a lot of people have spent an awful lot of time, blood, sweat, and tears and investment. This is not something we can be cavalier about. This is something where we can basically make sure that if we are being sensible about how we deploy things, and we're a little bit more open. I mean, there's so much secretive stuff going on right now. Things popping up and, oh, we're just carrying passengers out in the middle of the Pacific or something. It's like, wow, okay. I think really once we start seeing some more of these flight trials going on and some of the issues start becoming more apparent with some of the assets, then this is going to become far more focused. And whilst we obviously don't want to dwell on this, it's a hell of an exciting market and there could be some real great opportunity with these vehicles. Let's just take a little pinch of the reality salt back and make sure that we don't ever put any of these projects in a position that could affect the rest of us.
Right. Dave.
I'll second what Neil said from the safety side. I'll expand that also to the economic and the regulatory operational side for the people that are out doing things wrong, and I've had to deal with a lot of those people. You're giving everybody in the industry a bad name. If you're out doing improper cost sharing, if you're conducting what the FAA considers to be an illegal charter operation, that's not helpful to anybody. That's not going to be helpful to us to have that discussion with modifying regs and looking at this as there's a paradigm shift. So when kind of closing thoughts on how to deal, I don't know if we're there yet, but dealing with the FAA, dealing with the regulatory agency is common rules, and they're kind of related, garbage in, garbage out, and don't expect them to do your job. If you want to deal with them, you need to understand where they're coming from and understand the rules and make sure that you're dealing with them and not expecting them to do your job or just respond the way you want it without any background.
Gerhard, final thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, what we are seeing is that in the last years, or what we have heard in the last days also, is that the public opinion about drones darkening the sky is very negative. And of course, the public opinion also drives the regulator. And if there is something happening because of, let's say, because the industry is not cautious enough, then we will see that the regulator will answer to this, and this will, of course, impact the entire regulatory framework and will have a huge negative impact.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone.